Section A Introduction to Ecology. A1WHAT is ECOLOGY. Keynotes. A definition of ecology. Individuals, populations, communities, and ecosystems. Ecology is the study of the interactions between organisms and their environment. The environment is a combination of the physical environment, temperature, water availability, etc., and any influences on an organism exerted by other organisms, the biotic environment. There are 4 identifiable subdivisions of scale which ecologists investigate. I. Considering the response of individuals to their environments. E. Examining the response of populations of a single species to the environment, and considering processes such as abundance and fluctuations. E. The composition and structure of communities, the populations occurring in a defined area. IV. The processes occurring within ecosystems, the combination of a community and the abiotic components of the environment, such as energy flow, food webs, and the cycling of nutrients. A definition of ecology. Ecology is the study of the interaction between organisms and their environment. There are 2 distinct components to the environment: the physical environment, comprising such things as temperature, water availability, wind speed, soil acidity, and biotic environment, which comprises any influences on an organism that are exerted by other organisms, including competition, predation, parasitism, and cooperation. Within ecology there are a number of fields, either focusing on specific areas of interest or using particular approaches to address ecological problems. For example, behavioral ecology is concerned with explaining the patterns of behavior in animals. Physiological ecology explores the physiology of an individual and considers the consequences on function and behavior. A particular emphasis on the impact of evolution on current patterns is the focus of evolutionary ecology. A recent development has been the use of molecular biology to directly tackle ecological problems. Molecular ecology. The domains of population ecology and community ecology are described below. Ecological studies are not restricted to natural systems. Understanding both the human effects on nature and the ecology of artificial environments, such as crop fields, are important areas of study. Individuals, populations, communities, and ecosystems. Ecology can be considered on a wide scale, moving from an individual molecule to the entire global ecosystem. However, 4 identifiable subdivisions of scale are of particular interest: I. Individuals, E. Populations, E. Communities, and IV. Ecosystems. At each scale the subjects of interest to ecologists change. At the individual level the response of individuals to their environment, biotic and abiotic, is the key issue, whilst at the level of populations of a single species, the determinants of abundance and population fluctuations dominate. Communities are. 2. Section A Introduction to Ecology. The mixture of populations of different species found in a defined area. Ecologists are interested in the processes determining their composition and structure. Ecosystems comprise the biotic community in conjunction with the associated complex of physical factors that characterize the physical environment. Issues of interest at this level include energy flow, food webs, and the cycling of nutrients. It should be noted that the terms population, communities, and ecosystems are often ill-defined. It is often not possible to clearly delineate where one population stops and another starts, and the same problem occurs with communities and ecosystems. To some degree, these terms simply represent convenient simplifications by which we can categorize the natural world. Section A Introduction to Ecology. A2TENRULESINECOLOGY. Keynotes. What 8 these rules? Rule 1. Rule 2. Rule 4. Rule 5. The authors' experience of teaching ecology has given them experience of some common pitfalls which ecology students often make. This list, designed to counter these pitfalls, is neither comprehensive nor mutually exclusive, but we hope will nevertheless serve as a useful guide to protocol. Ecology is a science. Ecology is a purely scientific discipline which aims to understand the relationships between organisms and their wider environment. It is important to segregate political and social impacts of ecological understanding from the scientific viewpoint. Ecology is only understandable in the light of evolution. The huge diversity of organisms, and the wealth of variety in their morphologies, physiologies, and behavior are all the result of many millions of years of evolution. This evolutionary history has left an indelible impression on each and every individual. It is only possible to make sense of the patterns we find today in the light of this evolutionary legacy. Nothing happens for the good of the species. A very common misconception is the idea that patterns of behavior in organisms which appear to be costly to an individual occur for the good of the species. This is absolutely and completely wrong. Natural selection will favor those genes which are passed on to the most offspring, even if these genes may cause a reduction in the species' population size. Genes and environment are both important. The environment an organism finds itself in plays an important role in determining the options open to that individual. The genes which define an organism's makeup are also of fundamental importance. To understand ecology, it is important to appreciate the fundamental nature of both of these factors and the fact that they interact. Understanding complexity requires models. Ecology is a complex subject, with huge variation at almost every scale, millions of species, each with considerable genetic variation, varying numbers and ever-changing behaviors in a complex and dynamic environment. To understand it, it is necessary to clearly identify specific questions and then formulate hypotheses which can be tested. It is often very useful to frame the hypothesis in mathematical terms to avoid ambiguity and confusion which are often inevitable in a verbal model. Mathematical models are widely used in ecology. 4. Section A Introduction to Ecology. RNLZ 6 Storytelling is dangerous. In attempting to explain ecological patterns or relationships, it is easy to slip into a make-believe world where every observation is readily explained by some ad hoc assertion storytelling. The temptation to advance hypotheses as facts should be avoided at all costs. Rule 7. There are hierarchies of explanations. For any observation there is often an immediate cause that can be diagnosed. Often this causal explanation is insufficiently informative and we need to probe deeper to reach a fuller grasp of the situation. Even if a phenomenon is explained, there may well be further and deeper explanations which allow us to see the fuller picture. Rule 8. There are multiple constraints on organisms. Whilst the total diversity of form, function and environmental resilience exhibited by organisms is awe-inspiring, each individual and, to a slightly lesser extent, each species operates within a relatively narrow range of constraints. Constraints fundamentally take two forms, I physical and E evolutionary. Evolution can never reach perfection, because of these constraints and organisms are essentially hodgepodges of numerous compromises. Chance is important. Chance events play a critical role in ecology. The opening of a gap in a forest canopy or the breaching of a sand dune after a storm will have a major impact on the ecology of the local fauna and flora, but both are unpredictable in either time or location. The role of chance is also integral to the evolutionary past of organisms. The importance of chance events in ecology does not mean ecological patterns are wholly unpredictable, but it necessarily places boundaries on the potential level of predictive detail. Rule 10. The boundaries of ecology are in the mind of the ecologist. Ecology is a broad science, covering both organisms and physical environments and hence excludes little as potentially relevant. Mathematics, chemistry and physics are tools essential to the understanding of ecology. What are these? The author's experience of teaching ecology, and the relayed comments of their rules, colleagues, has given them insight into some common pitfalls which ecology students make. This set of rules is designed to counter these pitfalls and set students on the right course. The list is neither comprehensive nor mutually exclusive, but we hope will nevertheless serve as a useful guide. Rule 1. Ecology is a science. Ecology is a purely scientific discipline which aims to understand the relationships between organisms and their wider environment. Like any science, the outcomes of ecological studies do not dictate ethical or political actions. It is important to make this distinction because the environmental movement has endowed the word ecology with political connotations. It is right that ecology should inform politics, but as a student of ecology it is imperative to consider ecological research from a rigorous scientific viewpoint. A2TEN Rails in Ecology 5. Rule 2. Rule 3. Rule 4. Ecology is only understandable in the light of evolution. The huge diversity of organisms, and the wealth of variety in their morphologies, physiologies and behavior are all the result of many millions of years of evolution. This evolutionary history has left an indelible impression on each and every individual. It is only possible to make sense of the patterns we find today in the light of this evolutionary legacy. For example, if we want to understand why the ostrich, emu, kiwi and rhea are all flightless, an unusual condition in birds, it is critical to know that these birds all share a common ancestor which was flightless, and that the species above became separated on different continents by the breakup of the ancient continent Gondwanaland. Therefore, looking for an independent adaptive reason for flightlessness in each species would be flawed. At a wider level, the tendency of evolution to optimize organisms' fitness, although see Rule 8 provides ecologists with a valuable tool in hypothesizing organism structure and behavior. Thus, the large size of the peacock's tail suggests that males with larger tails have higher levels of fitness, and indeed data supports this hypothesis. Some authors have suggested that the environment is the fundamental constraint on organisms and that ecology can more or less ignore evolution and genetics. This is a clear misinterpretation of the evidence. There is now ample evidence of short-term evolutionary changes which affect ecological patterns. Some of the best documented examples are the evolution of resistance to pesticides in crop pests and antibiotics in bacteria, and similar patterns have been observed in natural systems. Further, genes control every aspect of an organism, including the way it responds to the environment, so they must be the dominant component. Ecologists considering the behavior of animals should understand that animal behavior is controlled by genes just as much as gut enzymes are. There are now many examples where genes for behavioral traits have been identified. Nothing happens for the good of the species. A common misconception is the notion that patterns of behavior in organisms which appear to be costly to an individual, for example the dying of a female octopus immediately after giving birth or the defensive suicidal attacks of some soldier ants, are for the good of the species. This argument is absolutely and completely wrong, and only advanced by those who fail to grasp the importance of Rule 2. Natural selection will favor those genes which are passed on. This argument is absolutely and completely wrong, and only advanced by those who fail to grasp the importance of Rule 2. Natural selection will favor those genes which are passed on to the most offspring. If the genes for suicidal behavior in ants or early death in octopuses were good for the species but bad for the individuals carrying them, evolution would favor their replacement with other genes. Equally fallacious, for the same reason, is the argument that population size is limited via reduced birth rates for the good of the species. Both altruism and population regulation are easily understandable in terms of evolution acting on individuals. Genes and environment are both important. The environment an organism finds itself in plays an important role in determining the options open to that individual. Environmental conditions will define the birth rate, growth rate and level of mortality of a species. However, the genes which define an organism's makeup are also of fundamental import. 6th section, Introduction to Ecology. Rule 5. TANS. The emergent phenotype of an organism is a joint product of its genetic code and the environmental stimuli that affect it during development. Environment plus genotype equals greater than phenotype. To understand ecology, it is important to appreciate the fundamental nature of both of these factors, and the fact that they interact. Understanding complexity requires models. At face value, ecology might appear incomprehensible: millions of species, each with varying numbers and ever-changing behavior set in the context of a structurally complex and dynamic environment. Clearly, we cannot understand it all at once. The solution is a two-step process, firstly to identify a small and specific question, such as why do male blackbirds form territories, and then to test a specific hypothesis, for example male blackbirds with a territory have a better chance of getting a mate. What we have done is to construct a verbal model of the world, which we then set about testing. Sometimes, the model we want to test is more complex, such as when collecting food for its nestlings, a starling needs to consider both how far away the nest is and how difficult it is to forage with a beak full of worms. Starlings become slower and slower at catching prey as their beaks become fuller, but if the nest is a long distance away, it is worth spending more time catching prey. When we have a complex model like this, it is best to frame it in terms of simple mathematics, otherwise ambiguities and confusions are easily introduced. The predictions of a mathematical model of starling foraging behavior and some data from real starlings are shown in Figure 1. The model appears to provide a good description of starling behavior, quantifying the degree to which starlings increase the load of prey as the distance to the foraging ground increases. Simple and more complex mathematical models are now widely used in ecology. Even complex models usually have a simple verbal explanation. This book employs a minimum level of mathematics, but remember that such models are integral to ecology. 7R 0 I 0 10 20 30 40 50 60 70 80 90 100. Round trip time S. Figure 1. The application of a mathematical model in ecology. The dashed line is the predicted relationship between the length of the round trip from nest to foraging ground to nest and the number of prey carried. The dots represent observations. A210 rise in Info V7. Rule 6. Rule 7. Rule 8. Storytelling is dangerous. In attempting to explain ecological patterns or relationships, it is easy to slip into a make-believe world where every observation is readily explained by some ad hoc assertion, such as a classic examination blunder: polar bears are white so they are hidden from predators in the snow. The problem being, obviously, that there are no natural predators of polar bears. Such errors are not restricted to undergraduates, they are commonplace in popular natural history writing and films. Creativity should be encouraged in scientists at the level of constructing hypotheses. Indeed, an imaginative and probing mind is essential. However, the temptation to advance such hypotheses as facts should be avoided. There are hierarchies of explanation S. For any observation there is often an immediate cause that can be diagnosed. Often this causal explanation is insufficiently informative and we need to probe deeper to gain a fuller grasp of the situation. For example, a radio-tagged mole was found to have been stationary for 3 days. The proximal explanation of this was simple: it was dead. Further investigation found that it had a high density of gut parasites, which were the likely cause of death. It may have been possible to further investigate whether the mole was genetically predisposed to parasite infection or whether the environmental conditions had favored parasite survival, or some further explanation. The level of explanation required depends on the question being asked. For example, we might ask, why do males of many duck species adopt a bright or high contrast breeding plumage? The immediate causal explanation is that testosterone levels rise in spring and cause the changes. For an ecologist, this explanation is insufficient, but a fuller explanation is rooted in the fact that drakes with dull plumage generally have low mating success. Clearly there are further explanations beyond this. Why do dull drakes fail? Why do drakes show seasonal plumage variation when many birds do not? The point is that even if a phenomenon is explained, there may well be further explanations which shed a different light on the observation, without the original explanation being in any way wrong. There are multiple constraints on organism S. Whilst the total diversity of form, function and environmental resilience exhibited by organisms is awe-inspiring, each individual, and to a slightly lesser extent, each species operates within a relatively narrow range of constraints. Constraints fundamentally take two forms: I, those imposed by the laws of physics, physical constraints, and E, those caused by the vagaries of evolutionary history and the limitations on genetical flexibility, evolutionary constraints. Physical laws dictate what is and is not possible for organisms to achieve. Thus, it is not possible for an elephant to have the limb proportions of a gazelle, because, whilst an elephant is only roughly 4 times as long as a gazelle, it is about 64 times the weight, and hence needs limbs 64 times stronger, because volume, and hence weight, increases cubically as length increases linearly. 43 equals 64. There is thus a trade-off between nimbleness and large size. Similarly, there is an upper size limit on single-celled organisms, such as bacteria, which rely on diffusion over their outer surface to uptake assimilates, because as the size of an organism increases, the volume increases more rapidly than the surface area. Big bacteria would not be able to transfer assimilates to their centers. Physical constraints thus impose ubiquitous trade-offs. 8th section: A Introduction to Ecology. Rule 9. Mammal octopus. Figure 2. A diagrammatic comparison between the eye of an octopus and that of a mammal, indicating how different evolutionary histories have produced a blind spot in mammals but not in octopuses. The size of the retinal cells is greatly exaggerated. Evolutionary constraints are equally ubiquitous, but much less predictable. For example, the blind spot in the vertebrate eye occurs because of a basic design fault. The nerve connections of the photoreceptive cells are on the inner edge of the retina, the side which the light hits, and nerve fibers merge, forming the optic nerve, and exit the retina together. At this spot no light can be detected, resulting in a zone of missing vision, a blind spot. There is nothing inevitable about this arrangement, and indeed in the octopus, a mollusk, which evolved advanced eyes independently of vertebrates, the retinal cells are the right way up, with nerve connections on the outer edge. Fig. 2. Where the nerve fibers merge to form the optic nerve, they are already on the outer edge of the retina and so there is no blind spot. Another example is that of the laryngeal nerve, which in fish passes directly from the brain to behind the sixth gill arch. During evolution, the gill arches have been transformed and the sixth gill arch in mammals is now represented by a blood vessel near the heart. The result is that in mammals the laryngeal nerve takes a detour, going from the brain to the heart and returning to the larynx. In long-necked mammals, such as giraffes, this detour is considerable. A much better design would be a direct connection from brain to larynx, but evolution has not offered this opportunity. Evolution can never achieve perfection. Because of these constraints, and organisms are essentially hodgepodges of numerous compromises, despite the many examples of amazing design. Chance is important. Chance events play a critical role in ecology. The opening of a gap in a forest canopy after a storm will have a major impact on the ecology of the fauna and flora of the forest floor, but it is unpredictable in either time or location. Similarly, the dynamics of sand dune and rocky shore species is dominated by the random destruction and creation of new, bare colonizing surfaces. The population decline of the passenger pigeon Ectopus migratorius, which was so numerous in North America in the 18th century that flocks passing overhead blocked out the sun for minutes at a time, was largely caused by overhunting and subsequently diminished breeding success at low population densities. However, extinction was finally caused by the chance combination of A2TN rules in Ecology 9. Disease in a harsh winter. The role of chance is also integral to the evolutionary past of organisms, as the blind spot of the vertebrate I, see Rule 8 and Fig. 2 illustrates. The importance of chance events in ecology does not mean ecological patterns are wholly unpredictable, but it necessarily places boundaries on the potential level of predictive detail. Rule 10. The boundaries of ecology are in the mind of the ecologist. A science which covers both organisms and physical environments necessarily excludes little as potentially relevant. Of course, few ecologists have direct need for an understanding of astrophysics or the behavior of quarks, but, depending on the question studied, it may be essential to understand, for example, the chemistry of clay when investigating the availability of nutrients to plant roots or the physics of flight when studying the energetics of hummingbirds. A good ecologist regards mathematics, chemistry, physics and other disciplines as tools essential to the understanding of ecology. Section B. Adaptation to the environment. B1ADAPTATION. Fitness is a measure of the ability of an individual to produce viable offspring and contribute to future generations. Individuals vary in their relative fitness, and this variation is due partly to genetic differences among individuals and partly to environmental influences. The individuals in a species which have the highest fitness will contribute disproportionately to the subsequent generations. If fitness differences have a genetic component, then the genetic makeup of the subsequent generations will be altered. This process is known as natural selection or survival of the fittest. Any heritable trait possessed by an organism which aids survival or reproduction is an adaptation. Such traits may be physiological, morphological or behavioral. Adaptation is the result of natural selection. The genotype is the genetic composition of an individual. The phenotype is the individual organism, a product of the interaction between its genotype and its environment. The ability of the phenotype to vary due to environmental influences on its genotype is known as phenotypic plasticity, e.g. human suntan, wind-shaped plants, locust morph, solitary or migratory. 10 rules in ecology. A2. Speciation. O2. Genetic variation. OL. Fitness. The fitness of an individual will be high if that individual gives rise to many offspring which themselves are reproductively successful. Fitness will not necessarily be maximized by producing the most offspring. It may be better to produce fewer, larger offspring which will have better survivorship. Individuals may have higher fitness due to their possession of genes which give advantage. An example of this occurs in insecticide resistance. In the Australian sheep blowfly, Lucilia cuprina, resistance to the organophosphate insecticide malathion was found to be conferred by a gene called RMAL. Flies homozygous for this gene tolerate a high level of malathion, which will kill flies not possessing the gene. Clearly, if malathion was used as a control agent, we would anticipate the RMAL gene to increase in frequency in subsequent generations. An individual's contribution to future generations may also be influenced by non-genetic factors. Environmental differences between individuals, such as the quality of food an animal receives during development, will influence fitness. However, as these differences are not inherited by their offspring, no adaptation will result. Evolution can only occur when differences are inherited. Keynotes. Genotype MD phenotype. Related topics. 12 Section 8 Adaptation to the environment. Natural selection. Adaptation. Those individuals within a population which survive and reproduce most successfully, i.e. those with the highest fitness, will contribute more offspring to subsequent generations than individuals with lower fitness. If fitness differences have a genetic component, then the genes which the fittest individuals possess will become commoner, whilst the genes which the least fit individuals possess will become rarer. Thus, differential fitness amongst individuals results in genetic change in the population. Populations of the fly Drosophila melanogaster are often found in association with wine production, where they are exposed to unusually high levels of ethanol. Such populations have an elevated ethanol detoxification ability, as natural selection has led to possession of higher activity levels of the alcohol dehydrogenase ADH enzyme. Any heritable trait, one which is capable of being transmitted to the next generation, be it behavioral, morphological or physiological, which aids survival or reproduction in a particular environment, is an adaptation to that environment. Adaptation is the result of natural selection acting on heritable differences in fitness. It may be noted that non-heritable traits, such as the age of an individual, may also influence survival and reproduction, but such phenomena have no effect on evolution. In a North American fish, the desert sucker Cotostomus clarkii, an esterase enzyme occurs in two forms which differ in their optimal temperatures. Northerly populations possess the alleles coding for the low temperature enzyme, whilst in southerly populations the alleles coding for the high temperature enzyme predominate. Figure 1. In the peppered moth, Biston beetleria, there are genetically based color differences. Figure 2. Pale individuals predominate in unpolluted areas of Britain where they are camouflaged from avian predators against lichen-covered trees, whilst melanic dark-colored individuals are favored in polluted areas where lichens are absent and tree trunks are darkened by soot. Figure 1. Adaptation to local temperature in the desert catfish. Reprinted from Evolution in Modern Biology, Studies in Biology No. 87, K.J.R. Edwards, 1977, with permission from Cambridge University Press. B1 Adaptation 13. Genotype and phenotype. Figure 2. Adaptation to different colored backgrounds in the peppered moth, Biston beetleria. Each form is cryptically colored in the habitat it is found in. The genotype is the genetic composition of an individual. In sexual outcrossing species, usually most individuals have differing genotypes. The phenotype is the individual organism, a product of the interaction between its genotype and its environment. In asexual species, such as aphids, a group of individuals may share a genotype, but, due to differing environmental influences, exhibit different phenotypes. For example, if plant quality falls, wingless aphids will produce winged offspring, with the same genotype as the mother. This ability of the phenotype to vary due to environmental influences on its genotype is known as phenotypic plasticity. Other examples are suntan in humans, wind-shaped plants, and different morphs in locusts, solitary or migratory, which are cued by temperature and humidity. Section B. Adaptation to the environment. B2COPINGWITH. Environmental variation. Keynotes. Conditions. Variable environmental factors which organisms respond to are conditions. Examples include temperature, acidity and salinity. Conditions are not depletable, they are not used up or consumed by an organism. Resources. Anything which the organism uses up or depletes is a resource for that organism. Thus, nectar is a resource for honeybees, and light is a resource for all green plants. Environmental. Most organisms have to cope with a continually changing external variation environment over a range of timescales. Some environmental factors may change over seconds or minutes, e.g. sunlight intensity when there is patchy cloud, whilst others may change daily or seasonally or over a much longer period, e.g. glaciation cycles. Internal regulation. Biological cells cannot function with a wildly fluctuating environment, and organisms therefore take steps to limit their internal variation. Homeostasis. The maintenance of a relatively constant internal environment by an organism in a variable external environment is called homeostasis. All organisms adopt a degree of homeostatic control, but, as a rule, large organisms are more decoupled from their external environment than small ones. Negative feedback. Most biological homeostatic mechanisms act in a broadly similar way. If the current internal level of a factor, e.g. temperature or osmolarity, is too high, the mechanism will reduce it. If the level is too low, the mechanism will increase it. This process, by which the response is opposite to the signal, is known as negative feedback. Tolerance. Organisms can cope with variation in their external environment, though different species may differ markedly. The upper and lower extremes of environmental conditions which members of a species can survive are the species limits of tolerance. Usually, growth will not occur at these extremes but in a narrower range of conditions, and fitness will be greatest only for a yet narrower optimal range. Related topics. Plants and water. D2. Responses to temperature. E2. Animals and water. D3. Solar radiation and plants. Fi. Conditions. Except for a very few organisms living in extremely stable environments, e.g. the deep ocean, organisms are exposed to variable environmental factors which have direct physiological and behavioral impacts. The most obvious and general. B2. Coping with environmental variation. 15. Resources. Environmental variation. Internal regulation. Homeostasis. Of these is temperature variation, although acidity, salinity, osmolarity and radiation are also important to various organisms, as is disturbance caused by, for example, falling raindrops or spatting rivers. Conditions are not used up or consumed by an organism and are hence not depletable, in contrast to resources. A resource is anything which an organism depletes. This is not simply food, but light and inorganic nutrients for plants and, importantly, space, e.g. a great tit's nesting hole is, once used, unavailable to other great tits. The single most important resource is solar radiation, which is the sole source of energy for green plants. It should be noted that the dichotomy between conditions and resources only exists for a particular organism. Thus, solar radiation is a condition for an insect, but a resource for a plant. Further, occasionally the same factor can be both a resource and a condition. For example, a plant uses water as a resource, but heavy rainfall, which might lodge the plant or wash it away, represents a condition. Environmental conditions are constantly changing. The Earth's diurnal rotation and the annual rotation of the Earth around the Sun drive changes in temperature and radiation, and these, coupled with the centrifugal motion of the planet and convection currents, cause climatic changes on timescales from seconds to years. Glaciation cycles occur over yet larger timescales. The Pleistocene, which began 1.7 million years ago, has experienced about 18 glaciations, each lasting about 90,000 years and separated by a warm interglacial period, like the present one lasting about 10,000 years. Conditions may also be altered by the impact of other organisms. For example, in the absence of oxygen, heterotrophic bacteria will reduce the pH of soil, i.e. increase its acidity. Biological processes at the cellular level are sensitive to environmental conditions and can only operate within relatively narrow ranges of temperature, pH and osmolarity. For example, the human body must maintain internal temperatures very close to 37 degrees Celsius. Deviations of only a few degrees above or below this will be fatal if sustained. Maintenance of a constant internal environment, homeostasis, requires continuous monitoring and exchange of energy and materials with the external environment. To maintain a relatively constant internal environment in the presence of very variable external conditions requires homeostasis. Even the simplest organisms take steps to limit their internal variation. For example, bacteria may regulate internal ion concentrations. Larger organisms, because they have a lower surface area, volume ratio, are more decoupled from the environment. As they also tend to possess more sophisticated homeostatic machinery than the simplest prokaryotes, they can maintain homeostatic balance in a wider range of conditions. Homeostatic regulation can occur by physiological mechanisms, as in the example below, or by behavioral strategies. For example, lizards sun themselves in the morning to elevate their body temperatures. Negative feedback. Most homeostatic mechanisms rely on a negative feedback process. Any homeostatic mechanism has three basic components: a receptor, a control center, and 16. Section B. Adaptation to the environment. Tolerance. An effector. The receptor detects a change in a key internal condition, for example the blood osmolarity of a mammal pig. 2. The control center processes this information and compares it to a set point, or optimal value. If the variable is not tolerably close to this set point, the control center will direct a response by an effector. In the example in Figure 1, the hypothalamus serves as both a receptor and a control center for monitoring the blood osmolarity. If the blood osmolarity is too high, i.e. the blood is too concentrated, the hypothalamus will direct a thirst response, which, when satiated, will cause the blood osmolarity to fall. On the other hand, if the blood osmolarity is too low, i.e. the blood is too dilute, then a response of water loss will be directed in the kidneys, which will cause blood osmolarity to rise again. An organism adapted to its environment can cope with variation around some optima for a range of environmental conditions. Some species are more particular than others in their requirements. For example, the sticky catchfly Silene viscosa germinates over a range of 23 degrees Celsius, whilst the closely related ragged robin Lichnis flows cuculi only germinates over a range of 13 degrees Celsius. The degree of environmental variation that a species can cope with is that species' range of tolerance. Organisms will perform best in an optimal environment and will tend to reproduce only in conditions close to that. 2. As conditions deviate further from the optimal, individuals will become too stressed to be able to reproduce, though growth may occur. As conditions approach the upper and lower extremes of environmental conditions which individuals can survive, the species' limits of tolerance, no growth occurs. The growth and survival temperature response of the spider beetle Tinus tectus is shown in Fig. 3. 112 Coggling with environmental variation 17. Survival. Growth. Reproduction. Figure 2. A generalized illustration of the performance of a species in respect of an environmental condition. T0.02 W. 20100102030040. Temperature